Greetings and hello to everyone. This is the Business of Betting podcast, and I'm your host, Jake Williams. Today is episode 14, and we have founder and CEO of BitEdge, James Canning, joining the podcast. BitEdge is a leading source of Bitcoin sports betting information. James has a simple mission, and that is to provide useful resources to the Bitcoin betting public. BitEdge is a great website and resource for those looking for further details and information about the possibilities in the cryptocurrency and betting world. As always, you can find us at businessofbetting.com or at bettingpod on Twitter. Please fire in any questions or feedback and potential guests you would like to hear from. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed my chat with James Canning. Today I'm joined by James Canning, the CEO of BitEdge. James, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Jake. I really like the podcast and I'm happy to chat with you.
So James, let's start by digging into your background a little bit. You're obviously the CEO of BitEdge, but before you got there, and maybe do you want to just discuss your path to getting to where you are today and some of your background that as it relates to the business of betting?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I can't explain why, but a few months before the FIFA World Cup back in 2008, I was just getting excited about the tournament, and I thought I'd have a look to see what the odds are. And I can't explain why, but I really felt like getting a punt on. I was only about 20 years old at the time, and I'd never really bet before. But I just thought, it was in Germany. I thought Germany have a good chance to win, or Argentina's looking good. So I just put a couple of bets on. Completely casually, and I got one of the bets I put on to win was Italy, and they got up and won, and I've never looked back. I've just loved betting on sports since then and working in the gambling industry. So I did it. I just kept betting and got more and more serious with it, ended up betting full time, and then when I got married and wanted to settle down and have a real job, I went to work for the sports books. I worked first at sportsbook.com, which was a US-facing sports book based in Costa Rica. And then when we wanted to come back to Australia, I worked at Betfair at the Hobart office. While I was working at Betfair, I was still betting seriously, and people knew that, and people would come to me and ask me questions about sports betting in general. And when I would talk to customers, I was always taking their questions about using Betfair. And I just thought, I keep answering the same questions over and over again. So I decided to write down the most common questions I was getting and the answers, and just write down, I guess, what I thought was the most important things people needed to know to be able to make a profit betting on sports. And then as I was in the middle of doing that, I thought, well, I should put these up on a website somewhere. So I put them up on a website, and that's just evolved into my current project, BitEdge. So after I had the website running for a while, I discovered Bitcoin, and it completely changed the way I bet or changed my thinking about money and a lot of things. So I changed my website to be not just about sports betting in general, but particularly about sports betting with Bitcoin. So that's what's led me to bitedge.com. It's the leading source of information about Bitcoin gambling and about sports betting in particular.
So how did you grow your knowledge base when it comes to Bitcoin and I'm sure other fiat currencies, and using that, I guess, to produce information for the general public? Did you have some sort of education or background in that area, or did it just develop over time?
I was living in Thailand with a bunch of online poker professionals. This is at a time when I was a professional sports bettor, and it was a big problem for us was getting our money onto the websites and off the websites and in our home bank accounts or in our hands in Thailand. We were getting big delays, big fees. Sometimes our accounts would get shut down because we were transacting in different countries. And it was just a big pain point in our lives, was dealing with this government currency. So a lot of my friends who are professional poker players, they started playing with Bitcoin. And they're saying, this is great. You can just sign up to a site, put your money on straight away, get your money off straight away. There's no friction. It's just so easy to use Bitcoin. So, I mean, the first time I heard about Bitcoin, I thought it sounded like some scam. I thought it was just a way for whoever created it to get rich. So I kind of ignored it. And then some of my friends were using it and they liked it. And these were my smartest friends, actually, and my most wealthy friends too. They told me I should look into it. I looked into it again and I thought, it's kind of like World of Warcraft gold, like just some fake money. Maybe they have fun playing with it, whatever. And then the third, it wasn't until like the third or fourth time I looked into it that I actually had my aha moment and, the light bulb went off above my head. What made me actually understand how important Bitcoin was understanding how government currency works. So when I worked out how and why inflation happens, that it's not just a natural thing that happens always, it actually happens for a reason and affects me, then I started to appreciate the Bitcoin alternative with no inflation. And since I was living overseas and trying to do all these cross-border transactions, Bitcoin just made my life so much easier. So I just got to like it, and then I got to really fall in love with the community in general, and I started, always hanging out with other Bitcoiners online and going to Bitcoin meetups, and just got deeper and deeper into it until I realized that this was what I wanted to be in, and I put all my savings in Bitcoin, and I've made all my income in Bitcoin, and for about 4 years now, I've been almost 100% Bitcoin.
Okay, so before we lose all of our non-Bitcoin fans, let's just touch on some of the basics of Bitcoin. And when we say Bitcoin, certainly when I say Bitcoin, I won't speak for you. I mean any of the cryptocurrencies that you hear about, Ethereum and some of the other ones out there. But I think just for keeping it simple for someone like myself, who's certainly no expert in cryptocurrency or the blockchain or anything like that, when I say Bitcoin, I mean any of those, different currencies that you've heard about, probably more widespread and mainstream now. But let's just touch on 4 or 5 of the basic buzzwords just for background. I want to keep it as betting related as possible and get to the markets and some of the predictions you've had in the past and talk about that a little bit deeper. But before we go, do you want to start with the blockchain?
I'll start even more basic. So Bitcoin is a currency like the US dollar or the Australian dollar. The difference is those currencies are run by governments, and Bitcoin is not run by government. It's run by people running software. So Bitcoin is run by the Bitcoin network, and it's an online currency. So the main differences are there's a limited amount of Bitcoin, whereas with the US dollar, there's essentially an unlimited amount. The government can make as many dollars as they want. Banks can make dollars. Anyone or a lot of people can make new dollars, and that's what causes inflation. But with Bitcoin, there's a limited supply, so there'll never be more than 21 million Bitcoins. So it's more like a precious metal, like gold, or like a commodity, in that there's a limited supply. And the other big differentiator is that to use Bitcoin, you don't need any third parties. Like for me to send money to you, we don't need a bank, we don't need a company, we don't need anybody's permission. It's just direct, peer-to-peer. So a lot of your listeners will be familiar with BitTorrent. So Bitcoin is a bit like BitTorrent, but for money. And it makes sending and receiving money just as easy as sending and receiving an email. Blockchain, that is actually a little technical. Blockchain is the way that Bitcoin keeps track of all the transactions. So you can send and receive money online. Money is digital. Now, the problem with most digital things, like say an MP3 or a digital photograph, is that they can be reproduced. if you have a digital photo on your computer, you can make 100 copies of it. With Bitcoin, we had to have a way to prevent that, and we use cryptography and we use the blockchain, and that's, I think, it's not related to gambling, so it might be more than what you want to get into here. But blockchain allows a record of all Bitcoin transactions, which is impossible to change. So it's an immutable ledger. Whereas with government currency, your bank keeps a ledger of how much money you have, how much money its other customers have. And with Bitcoin, the ledger is the blockchain, and everyone has a copy of the ledger. So everyone can see how much Bitcoin is held in each address, but they can't see who owns that address.
So a few people I've been speaking to recently will say, well, the US dollar's backed by gold, so therefore there's something behind it. And they say that's why Bitcoin will never work. I don't think they necessarily understand it completely, and not that I do, but do you want to just quickly run through why Bitcoin doesn't need to be backed by a precious metal or another commodity?
Yeah, well, the idea that the US dollar is backed by gold is wrong on so many levels. The most obvious one, of course, is that the US dollar is not backed by gold. It hasn't had any relationship to gold since the 1970s. And even before then, it was a very tenuous relationship to gold. So the US dollar is backed by nothing, certainly nothing physical or no other asset. But actually, that's not a problem. Current money doesn't need to be backed by something else. Money is actually a way for us to keep track of our purchasing power and our debts. Money is a ledger. It's not actually supposed to be valuable in itself. Money represents value. So money is an abstraction layer, as the kind of technical or term. Money is an abstraction layer that sits on top of value. So the value is your work, your goods, and money is the way we keep track of how much purchasing power we have and how much debt we have. So the US dollar or government currencies are not backed by anything, but that's not actually the problem with them. Money doesn't actually need to be backed by anything. So you could say the US dollar is backed by the US military. It's backed by the fact that people have to pay their taxes in US dollar, so that gives it a guaranteed demand. You could say it's backed by the full faith of the Federal Reserve Bank, things like that. And with Bitcoin, Bitcoin gets its value from being useful and being scarce. So it has a limited supply, so it's scarce and it's very useful. That's where the value in Bitcoin comes from.
So let's get into some of the fun betting related stuff, and on the business side, like we usually talk about. So in July 2014, so 3 years ago essentially, you had some predictions about the growth of Bitcoin, and it was predicated on the gambling and the betting side. Essentially, and I don't want to paraphrase you, but I will, you claim that Bitcoin could take up to 5% of the estimated $3 trillion worldwide gambling market. So in 2013, that was about 24 billion, and your prediction was that, in the next 4 years it would get up to 150 billion. So we're 3 years into that 4 years. Essentially, that's an estimation that the price of Bitcoin would go from around 600 to 4,000. We've seen it basically hover around $2,600, $2,700, $2,800 recently. So what's happened in those 3 years? And it seems as though your estimations are looking very, very correct. Can you just take us through the last 3 years and how that's evolved to take up some of that gambling market?
Yeah, great. We should probably say that was in US dollar figures. So I had a blog post about that called "Bitcoin is the Future of Gambling," where I laid out that prediction. And yeah, at the moment it's on track. In terms, some of the indicators of that prediction are on track. So what's happening? So Bitcoin is getting very popular for online gambling, and that's because gambling with government currency can be such a pain. I mean, you're in a lot of our listeners are in Australia, which is a gambling-friendly jurisdiction, and they think it's pretty easy to get a bet online. But if you're in China, or if you're in India, or if you're in the United States, or if you're in Iran or Russia, or a lot of places, it's very difficult to actually get a bet online with government currency. Sometimes it's against the law, which means a lot of sites won't accept your account. Even if you find somewhere that will, you have to hand over all your identifying information. You have to use a credit card and all that things you give over to let's say the sports book, if it's an online sports book, that can all be used or misused in the future. So, but with Bitcoin, it's just really fast and easy. You can just sign up for an account with just a username and password. You don't need to put in any of your personal information, and then you can deposit Bitcoin, bet with it, withdraw it just instantly. So that's why Bitcoin is so popular for online gambling. It's because gambling with government currency is so high friction, but Bitcoin removes all the friction. So Bitcoin is getting a lot more popular in everything, in general in society for everything. But it's getting mostly popular in the things which are difficult with government currency, like cross-border transactions, like gambling, like buying drugs, anything which is difficult in government currency.
Let's talk about House Edge. For those who have bet into any totalizer pools, and obviously in Australia the largest one is the TAB, with the edge around 15% or something like that, which the operator takes out. Slot machines, which you'll see in a lot of casinos, or poker machines as we know them in Australia, seem to be around or hover around 10% edge. Then you've got other casino games, whether it's blackjack, and depending on the player, the games are essentially a 3-4% edge, something like that, depending on the actual rules of that game. With Bitcoin, you can get down to as low as 1 or 2% edge, and it's not a myth. There's actually been situations in games and options for punters and bettors to be able to bet with as low as 1% edge, and it may even be lower. I'm not 100% sure on that, but because of all the positive aspects of cryptocurrencies and a lot of the low transaction costs or the barriers to entry, those types of things are removed with Bitcoin. You can get such low edge. Can you talk about how it is that Bitcoin can get to such a low amount compared to the other house edges that are involved in, I guess, everyday gambling and I guess the widespread gambling that we're all able to access to a certain extent, depending on the jurisdiction?
Certainly. So, yeah, the standard kind of Bitcoin gambling site, the standard edge is about 1% house edge, which is much lower than government currency gambling options. And the reason is Bitcoin has so many advantages for both the gambler but also for the site operator. So the site operator loses most of their banking and transaction fees. The government currency sites have to pay. And the thing about keeping users anonymous, that's better for the user and it's better for the operator. The operator doesn't have to do all that KYC stuff, which just causes fraud and identity theft. It doesn't help anyone. It actually causes more crime than it prevents because it makes identity theft more of a thing. So they don't have to do all that, and they may or may not choose to get a license and pay taxes. Or pay those extra gambling taxes. So it removes a lot of the costs, and it makes them able to run much more efficiently, and it makes I would say the relationship between the gambler and the operator is just that direct peer-to-peer relationship without anyone else in between, without a bank, without a government getting in the way. So that's why they're able to offer a 1% house edge. And it's just keeps going lower and lower. One of the first big Bitcoin gambling site was Satoshi Dice. They had a 1.9% edge. Now we're down to a 1% edge, and it's inevitable we're heading towards 0% house edge gambling. Bitcoin will allow for 0% house edge gambling within the next few years.
So I understand why that's not a problem for dice games and casino-style games. But what about for sports betting, for example? is it feasible that it can get to as low as or as close to 0% edge for something whereby you can have smart operators, professional sports bettors who can win over time, and it's not a purely math situation, do you think? Or is it more focusing on the casino-style games and the, flipping of coin-style betting?
Yeah, you're right to differentiate the different types of gambling as they apply to the house edge. So with Bitcoin, it already is down to 2% house edge for sports betting in the case of a betting exchange. And yes, it will get down to like zero house edge or almost zero house edge in the case of betting exchanges and totalizers, that kind of model. The fixed odds model, like what most corporate bookmakers run, like what you see on Pinnacle or Bet365, that has a higher edge than say a betting exchange or a totalizer could have in the Bitcoin space. So we will see we won't see 0% house edge as quickly in those products.
So 0% edge implies that you'll break even over time. If you bet on a flip of a coin, 100 million times, chances are you're going to break even just based on the mathematics, especially if you get up to large sample sizes. What's the benefit of getting it down to 0% house edge? What ways will the operator be able to make money, especially because it sounds like if it becomes widespread and scalable, you'll just have more and more operators popping up, offering different promotions, offering perhaps even, a little bit less than a 0% house edge just to get people playing there. What are the benefits of getting such a low edge for those operators?
The benefit for the operator is to attract more users. So you're right that in the 0% house edge paradigm, on average, everybody's breaking even. There's a lot of ways that an operator or a gambling website can monetize while offering a 0% house edge. For example, with a 0% house edge on blackjack, you still make money because the 0% house edge calculation assumes optimal play by the player. So anytime the player does anything other than optimal play, you again have an edge in the house's favor. Now, if you wanted to offer a 0% house edge blackjack game that took that into account, you could add a jackpot, which would whatever edge you get by players' mistakes goes into the jackpot. But just a simple 0% house edge blackjack game, the site would still make money because of suboptimal play by the players. But if you can offer a good 0% house edge product, you'll have so many users. There's a lot of ways to monetize a user base of that size. You can do simple display advertising. You can have premium accounts with extra features. You can cross-sell other products to the users. You can sell the data if you have the user's permission. You can invest the players' deposits and earn interest on players' deposits. I mean, we already have gaming companies, like social gaming companies like Zynga. They used to have that free poker and, free slot companies that are very profitable, and they don't make any money on the games themselves. These are just, online fun gaming companies. They make money without actually making money from the games, from those other kind of things that I mentioned.
Yeah, so essentially they're using typical, I guess, digital media website strategies to make money when it comes to banner ads and display and video ads and subscriptions and things like that. It's just using those other tools and mechanisms to make money whilst having a product that is not necessarily, traditional digital media. It's a betting and a wagering product. So when you talk about suboptimal play, are you talking about, martingale theories where, someone keeps doubling their bet because they, want to win big, and eventually they're going to lose and the house will collect that money?
Let me just expand on your follow-up to my last answer. The things I mentioned are just typical online ways that businesses make money. I mean, Google doesn't charge anyone for their search engine, or Google doesn't charge anyone for their email service. Facebook doesn't charge anyone. They don't make any money off that core offering. They make money by getting lots of users and make money around the users. And the other thing is people the other reason people would offer 0% house edge gambling, even without making money, is what in venture capital is called a land grab. You run your business at a loss during the period where you're just trying to grow the user base. So you do what in startups is called a land grab. You run it at a loss for however long. And another reason is just because you want to change the world and change society. So you offer 0% house edge gambling just to kind of stick it to the man or for the love of it. And that's being done with one project called Edgeless.io. That's a 0% house edge gambling product which is doing that. Because with 0% house edge, it can actually change gambling's place in society. Like the reason gambling is often, kept in the shadows, or gambling is heavily regulated or even illegal or kind of looked down upon as a vice, is because most people lose money when they gamble. So in a 0% house edge paradigm, most people break even. On average, everyone breaks even. So it can actually really change gambling's place in society. It would take away government's justification for limiting people's gambling, things like that. So it's a big deal. And now, your question clarifying how the house makes money in blackjack with a 0% house edge. What I mean is blackjack is a game where the player has to make decisions, which is either to hit or to stand or to double or to take insurance. And when you calculate your 0% house edge, you have to assume that the player always makes the optimal decision. But in real life, the player is sometimes going to make a suboptimal decision. And that's where a house edge gets reintroduced.
Yeah, that makes sense. I understand. Can you take us through Satoshi Dice? It's obviously one of the big names when it comes to Bitcoin and gambling. Do you want to just go run through that product and why it was so successful?
Great. So just, I guess, to clarify for your listeners, I wouldn't say Satoshi Dice is a big name in Bitcoin gambling in 2017. It was a very big name. It was the first name in Bitcoin gambling, or the only name in Bitcoin gambling, in 2012, 2013. It's not so much anymore. So the reason Satoshi Dice is important is because it was a new model for offering online gambling, where you didn't have to create an account and you didn't have to make a deposit with the operator. So in Satoshi Dice, every bet was actually a Bitcoin transaction. So every bet was on the blockchain. So there was no need to actually have a deposit with Satoshi Dice. There was no need to have an account with Satoshi Dice. To give the basics, Dice is a simple gambling game where you're going to roll a dice where you get a value between 0 and 100, and you can bet on what you're going to roll. So you can say, I bet I'm going to roll over 50, and if you roll over 50, you win. If you roll under 50, you lose. And in Satoshi Dice, the way you put your stake up was by sending a Bitcoin transaction to Satoshi Dice. And then if you won, they would send the Bitcoin and another Bitcoin transaction back to you. So it was very, very popular. At one time, it was about 50% of the Bitcoin network. About 50% of Bitcoin transactions were just for gambling back in 2012 and early 2013.
Wow.
And so the reason it was important was it is important is because it created a new model where you don't have to have an account with the site. You don't have to have a deposit with their site, which means you're never trusting the site with your money. So the site can't run away with your money. The site can't do anything. The site can't do anything bad. The most they could do would be to, I guess, rip you off on one single bet. And yeah, Satoshi Dice was also provably fair, which is another topic. I'm not sure if you are interested in it, but provably fair is just a way to use cryptography to prove to the player that the game is not rigged.
So I'm sure people who follow poker and are aware of what happened on Black Friday, I don't know if it's a correlator or anything like that, but the provably fair concept takes that possibility away. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. How provably fair works is you can check how the random number was generated. So in the case of Poker, you can check how the random card was made to be random. So it stops operators from being able to decide the outcome of a game, or stops operators from knowing the outcome before the fact. And actually, it can be done with government currency operators. It doesn't actually use Bitcoin. It uses some kind of, I would say, Bitcoin values and Bitcoin logic in the way it uses cryptography, but it doesn't actually rely on Bitcoin. It's just something that was invented by Bitcoin gambling operators. The point about Black Friday, if you didn't have to have an account with the operator, then that would have made a big difference to that kind of situation where people had their money locked up in an account.
So if I wanted to invest on the, I guess let's call it the bookmaking side or on the operator side, unless there's an IPO and you want to buy stock in a bookmaking company, you can't necessarily do that very easily. Whereas we've seen examples with Just Dice in the Bitcoin gambling world where you can essentially be investing on the operator or the bookmaker side. Do you want to take us through that and any successes that have come from that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just Dice was a very important Bitcoin gambling site because it introduced a new model where you could invest in the house bank. So generally speaking, the way an online gambling site works is that you make your bet and the site has the house bank and pays out from the house bank, and the site generally provides the house bank itself. On Just Dice, instead of the site providing the house bank, anyone could make an account at Just Dice and put money into the house bank, and then you would receive a share of the site profit proportional to the amount of the house bank that you contributed. So when you've got money in the house bank, you've got those players on the site are actually betting against you. So you could, on Just Dice, you could play normally. You could be a normal user and play dice at a 1% house edge. And when you finish playing, you could move your money into the house bank, and other people would be betting into you. So it really changed the paradigm because, like you said, it's being on the right side of a casino is completely out of reach to most people. You mentioned like the most obvious way for an Australian might be to buy shares in Crown, but like most people in the world can't even do that. But with Just Dice, anybody could be on the right side of a gambling operation and have the edge in their favor. So to be in the Just Dice house bank, it was completely passive. You just put your money in there and then other people would bet against the house bank. So you didn't have to actively do anything. It was just an investment, and it was a brilliant investment. It made return more than 20% per year, and that was denominated in Bitcoin. And generally, the price of Bitcoin's been going up. So if it was denominated in government currency, it would have been even more than 20% per year.
How popular and successful was it? Was it only sort of known and useful for those who were in the Bitcoin community and world and understood what was happening and were happy to put their Bitcoin behind it and trusted the protocols and those type of things? Or did it catch on in the mainstream at all?
I know it was too early to go into the mainstream. It was popular back in 2013, and it was an end-to-end Bitcoin site. So it was only used by Bitcoiners and people in the Bitcoin community. But within the Bitcoin community, it was very popular and very successful. They had, I think by the end, they had something like $30 million worth of Bitcoin in the house bank.
So take us through the sign-up process for something like that. We all know what it takes, and if you live in the US and you probably think, I wonder how hard it is to sign up. Imagine you just moved to the US and you want to start a bank account or a credit card. You got to take in your passport, your latest electricity bill, maybe your lease, maybe one or two other forms of identification, driver's license or something. You go in, you fill out some forms, you show them all your documents, and then you get something maybe 2 or 3 days later. In Australia, to sign up for a bookmaking account, it used to be more difficult than it is now. There's some ways to do it through online and through your phone and taking some pictures of some different forms of ID. But take us through what it was like to sign up for something like Just Dice and have the ability to be on the operator or the house side when it comes to this type of technology and these type of protocols, where it's the costs of transaction and it doesn't take hours and days to do these types of things. It's much more, it's facilitated much easier.
Well, sign up for Just Dice or for most Bitcoin gambling sites is just a username and a password. That's it.
So it's easier to sign up there than it is Facebook, for instance.
That's right. It's as easy as signing up for maybe an email account or a Spotify account or something, even easier. Some sites request an email address, which they do mostly to be able to use that for security, so they can send you login pins and things like that. But usually that's optional. So it's just a username and password. You're completely anonymous, and that's how it should be, really.
So one of the obvious disadvantages is match fixing when it comes to sports. Do you want to talk a little bit about the possibilities when it comes to Bitcoin and match fixing? And I don't know of any public cases as of today. I might be wrong, and it may be, something that's happening. But do you want to just talk a little bit about the possibilities when it comes to match fixing and why that may cause issues down the line?
Well, you wouldn't know about any cases, would you?
Right, because it should be anonymous.
Not because they haven't happened, but because they would be private. So Bitcoin could be used for match fixing. It could be used in the current paradigm of match fixing, where you have an athlete that performs in line with the bets, and you have a fixer that communicates between the athlete and the gamblers. Then you have a group of gamblers which make the bets, and you need a group because they would need to make a lot of bets and they need to spread them out so it doesn't raise any suspicion. And then you probably need a money launderer, and these people are gonna have to send money between each other, most obviously to pay the player, for example, or to put the bets on. So Bitcoin can really make those kind of operations easier by using Bitcoin transactions, but it's a much bigger difference than that, is that Bitcoin would allow the whole operation to be done just by one single athlete. One single athlete could just make all the bets himself, perform in line with the bets, and then take all the money. So he wouldn't actually need that group of people anymore. Now, I should say Bitcoin makes everything easier. So Bitcoin makes shopping online easier. Bitcoin makes buying drugs easier. Bitcoin makes donating to charity easier. So match fixing is just another thing that Bitcoin makes easier. But it is something that people find very concerning. So because when I mentioned the current kind of model of match fixers, where you have that whole syndicate, the whole group of people, that's generally how law enforcement can detect the match fixing. Someone in that group talks to the wrong person, or the law enforcement will infiltrate that group with an inside man or something. Or, there's those famous grainy conversations between the fixer and the reporter, and Bitcoin would allow it to all be done just by the athlete. It would be really undetectable. So all the athlete has to do is maybe get a VPN, make 10 different accounts at 10 different Bitcoin sports books, make a bet on an outcome which they can influence, then influence that outcome, and then withdraw all the money. So there's nowhere for law enforcement to actually get into that process.
Right.
Or they can try to track the athletes. They would have to track all athletes' online activity, which is pretty much scuttled by just using a VPN. And then they would have to track the performance on the field, and then they'd have to track the spending. But again, the spending would be in Bitcoin. So, but even with those advantages, I'm sure we will see someone get busted for Bitcoin match fixing, because somebody will just not be careful enough, or somebody will brag about it, or somebody will just be too obvious in influencing the outcome of a bet. So yeah, the cases will come to light, and then there'll be some kind of phony moralistic outcry from politicians and think about the children and we must ban Bitcoin.
Yeah.
But we're going to have a lot of that in the next few years. So that might just be another case of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Bitcoin certainly doesn't discriminate. So have you seen any government regulation or government controls put in place? Obviously, some people might be, pulling their hair out and saying, well, clearly there's going to be tax avoidance and things like that, where why is it fair that someone, just because they're using Bitcoin, can avoid tax in certain situations? Has there been anything that you've seen or you've noticed in the past sort of 12, 18, 24 months around Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies to try and clamp down on these type of things?
Yeah, certainly. And governments getting very involved and looking very closely at the meeting points between Bitcoin and government currency. So when people buy and sell Bitcoin for a government currency, when they get into Bitcoin or when they get out of Bitcoin, that's the area where law enforcement and government can really scrutinize, and because they have access to all your private financial data in those types of transactions. So that's what government's focusing on, regulating the exchanges, and in some cases the wallets, where there's wallets where you can buy and sell inside the wallet. So governments doing that, and look, it's a constant, I guess, cat and mouse game. It always has been between tax authorities and people who don't want to pay tax. People who don't want to pay tax have always been looking for methods or advantages, since forever. So this is, I guess, just another evolution in that dynamic.
Certainly. So what do you think the future of the Bitcoin, especially related to sports betting, I guess, and some of the horse racing or other sports related stuff, is going to look like in the future, especially if we're talking about such low edges and perhaps companies want to make money off, I guess, other means and other typical means when you talk about the Facebooks and the Googles of the world and the land grabs that we spoke about and trying to get some advertising related revenues or things like that. How is it that, because that's certainly not part of the traditional model for, I guess, operators and paying gambling taxes and paying, product fees to sports in Australia and things like that. What sort of place do you think it might have, or do you think it's just going to be a tough, I guess, teething period and to try and get some of the sports on board, because there's other ancillary benefits when there is a lot of gambling on sports with low edges and more people actively engaged and trying to sell that, rather than, well, you're going to get a certain percentage of our gross profit on gambling. Well, if there's a house edge of, less than 2%, that gross profit on gambling is not necessarily going to be there. So do you have any sort of predictions, or have you seen any sort of movement in the industry that would, I guess, suggest how it might head in that direction?
Well, the future is very, very bright for the gambler, because Bitcoin has, and being a Bitcoin gambling operator, has such low barriers to entry. It just allows for competition. So gamblers are going to have much more options and much more freedom, and it's going to allow for more competition, which will make for better outcomes. You mentioned, will the sports get on board? Well, Bitcoin gamblers don't really care if the sports organization is on board or not, and will the government be happy about this when they can't take their pound of flesh? Well, I don't really care. I just as a gambler, I just want the best gambling product for me, which a big part of that is ease of use and a low house edge, and Bitcoin's going to provide that, which will then a government currency site or government currency gambling site will have to respond to that and up their game. So competition's going to be better for everyone.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree. I just wonder how if you want to be based in Australia and you want to offer sports betting and you want to have a low edge and you want to go down a different path with business model wise, it might be a difficult beginning to try and get that, I guess, adoption and get that understanding of exactly what's going on. And I think, convincing the non-believers in the beginning might be a little bit tough. And I think it's starting to happen a little bit with, in general when it comes to, different types of fiat currencies. But I wonder if the renowned sort of gambling regulators and bodies who have been slow to move in many aspects will be any quicker to move, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, in some sense, we've already seen that they are slow to move, and that they still haven't got their head around Bitcoin gambling and what it means for their kind of paradigm. And I mean, yeah, there might be the average Joe who believes that gambling operators should contribute to the governing bodies of the sport, and gambling operators should pay extra taxes. But when average Joe's at home in his living room and he's got a chance to bet on Arsenal at odds of 210 with Bitcoin, or at odds of 2 with a government currency book, he's probably going to want to make that bet on at 210.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we'll see depending on him as an individual. But I think Bitcoin will offer a better product, so it will inevitably keep growing its market share.
So I hear that you don't mind watching a gambling movie now and then, and I have asked in the past some other guests about some of their favorites. I have a few, Two for the Money. There's a couple of awful ones as well. I think someone mentioned Rounders. Take me through some of your gambling movies and I guess some of the favorite ones that you've seen.
Well, I've just lost all respect for you, given that you liked Two for the Money. That was a shocking movie.
See what I mean? People hate. I've got some shockers as well, but that's one of the ones that somehow resonated. There's Owning Mahoney's a good one. I don't mind that. There's a few out there.
Owning Mahoney is a good movie. Well done. You've salvaged. Yeah, even in Two for the Money, Al Pacino is very good. The movie is bad, but Al Pacino is very good. That kind of saves it. So yeah, I have a post on my website called Sports Betting Movies, where I've got a list of basically every sports betting movie you can possibly watch. All the movies on the list, they have a good torrent available so people can watch them. And on the site there, I put a YouTube video of that movie's preview. So I kind of separate them into two groups. There's movies that really are just about sports betting, where that's like the whole point of the movie. It's a sports betting movie. And there's really only one good one. It's called Bookies. It was like kind of the typical story of like college roommates start a bookmaker, and then it gets spirals out of control, and they end up talking with the mobsters. And it's a classic old corny story. But Bookies is a good movie, and that's the only good movie which is really just about sports betting. Then you have a lot of movies which are where sports betting is part of the story, or sports betting is part of the plot. And there's a lot of good movies in that category. That would be The Gambler, which is an old James Caan film. Very interesting, shows the problem gambling dynamic that people don't always understand, which is that a lot of problem gamblers, they actually want to lose because they're punishing themselves out of guilt. Well, something like that. The Gambler has a brilliant depiction of that by James Caan. 8 Men Out was the famous story of the Black Sox, the Chicago baseball team that threw the World Series back in 1919. That was since we were speaking about match fixing, that was maybe the first really big match fixing scandal. There's a good film about that. Then Owning Mahoney, as you mentioned, I really like that movie. And then there's a few more. They get kind of worse after that. White Men Can't Jump, gambling on the street. People should check out BitEdge sports betting movies to get the full list.
Absolutely, I haven't seen Bookies actually. I'm gonna have to check that one out. I've seen a lot of the ones you mentioned, but for some reason I haven't seen Bookies. So I'll have to have a look and get back to you on that one. Hopefully your acumen when it comes to the gambling movies is much better than mine. If you don't like Two for the Money, maybe I won't like Bookies, but let's see what happens. So, James, I'm cognizant of your time. I really appreciate you coming on the show and chatting about Bitcoin, and no doubt as things evolve and we see more traction in the marketplace and, some more Bitcoin exchanges popping up and some more sports books, around the world, we'll definitely have to have you back on to sort of catch up on what's happening. And it seems as though, given the movement in the last couple of years for Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, I have no doubt things will continue to accelerate, and having you chat about it has been fascinating for me, learn a lot about what's happening out there, and hopefully the listeners enjoyed chatting. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to chatting again soon.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jake. Just want to let people know all the topics that we've discussed. I've covered them on my website on BitEdge, probably much more coherently in writing than what I've what I've answered here in audio. So check out bitedge.com. Like we've got posts about Just Dice and 0% house edge gambling. We've got posts about house investment, posts about Bitcoin matchfixing, posts about sports betting movies, everything we've discussed actually. They can find out more on bitedge.com.
Awesome. Thank you very much, James, and we'll talk to you soon.